Once we are confronted with the unknowns, that's where questions start to boil up, where what we know comes into, confronted with the unknown. It's like, okay, what am I doing here? What's going on? How do I make sense of this? And so it is at that age that they start questioning their faith, as they're maybe in schools where the people around them are not believing what they believe, or they're going to go off to college, and what's going to happen here, and I need to be ready. And so it absolutely is a really crucial and important time. And so it's just a pleasure to step into that moment with students and help them walk through it well.
Why do so many young Christians feel like their faith is just another item on a crowded to-do list? Why does boredom creep in when it comes to something as life-changing as a relationship with God? Well, recent studies are showing a surprising shift. Gen Z men are now more likely than women to identify as religious. They're flipping a generational trend, but what does it really mean? And as culture moves faster and attention spans shrink, many in Gen Z are craving something deeper, something more real, something more meaningful. So in this episode, I'm going to ask one of my buddies some of these big questions about faith, purpose, identity, and how to actually think well in a reactive world. My guest is Ryan Pauly. Ryan is the founder of Think Well and Director of Immersive Experiences at MAVEN and Professor of Christian Apologetics at Biola University. So with a decade of experience teaching and mentoring students, Ryan began as a missionary in the Dominican Republic. And then he began to teach apologetics and theology in California for 12 years. Now he's launched Think Well, and he's active in training the next generation through Summit Ministries, Reasons to Believe, Talk About Doubts. I mean, he's doing so many amazing things, and he's got a hold on what is happening in this rising generation. We're going to speculate about it. I think you're going to be fascinated by what we discover. Ryan holds degrees in theology and apologetics and is pursuing, at the present moment, a doctor of ministry that is focused on biblical responses to today's most pressing cultural issues. Please welcome Ryan Pauly to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Ryan Pauly, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast.
Dr. Jeff, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
We've been friends for a few years, and you and your family come out to Summit Ministries in the summertime. You are with the students for 2 weeks at a time. You just live with them. You have meals with them. You speak to them. You have conversations with them. Really a pastoral role. And I just want to say thank you, because it's one thing to teach principles about apologetics or the top answers to the big questions. It's another thing to live them alongside the students that have these big questions. And I just want everybody who's watching or listening right now to know I admire you, because you're one of the guys who does that.
Wow. Well, that means so much. And it honestly is such a pleasure and a blessing for our family to be able to do this. This summer will be our 4th year, and it is the highlight of our year. We love just going there and hanging out with the students and playing volleyball and sitting down over meals and getting to know them. And it really is a highlight. We love it. And so I just thank Summit for the pleasure of being able to do it. I've been connected to the ministry a lot longer through teaching the curriculum as a high school teacher, but serving on faculty really has been such a joy.
And having your family here, your beautiful wife and your adorable little boys, is an amazing thing. The kids just love having the little ones around.
Yeah.
Because then it's more like a family reunion and less like a class.
Yep. Yeah, we brought our first one there, Lennox, when he was about 8 months old, I think. And then I actually had, I think year 2, I had to postpone because we were supposed to be there right around the same time as the due date for the birth of my second son. And I remember contacting Summit and saying, we're actually due that time. Can I push back like 5 weeks? Are we crazy being a 5-week-old to Summit for 2 weeks? And they said, well, yeah, kind of. We're like, all right, let's do it. And then last year we brought them both there at about a year old and then, I guess 2.5 years old. And so it's been a joy also just seeing them grow up there and the relationships that they can form. And then also just the girls there at Summit, asking to have meals with my wife and pulling my wife aside and just her being able to pour into them as well is just, I love it. I love seeing the family component, and it really is a unique and such a meaningful and powerful role that you guys have created there.
Well, it's fun. I can't wait. And here we're recording this when we're just about 2 weeks out from the beginning of the summer program. And we're just counting the minutes. We just can't wait for all of that to get started. And we're going to have a full house out here, Ryan. We are full. I think the only sessions that we even have openings, we have a handful of openings for guys in Georgia this summer. everything else is full with waiting lists. So they're going to be spilling out the windows. Oh, this is going to be fantastic. Well, let's talk. I want to talk just a little bit of foundation here. You're the founder of Think Well. Tell us a little bit about that ministry and your experience teaching the rising generation, because we're going to get into a topic here in a minute that everybody in America is talking about right now, which is the rise of religiosity in Gen Z.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Think Well, I founded it officially in June of 22, but it goes back a lot further. And ultimately, I went to college studying theology and youth ministry at Vanguard University and graduated and went off to the mission field. And that's where I first started teaching youth as a teacher in the school, but also working with students in a church and teaching different kind of theological and a worldview kind of issues, and really kind of diving into this question of why are students walking away from the faith, and seeing the numbers that were staggering, and really kind of coming to this conclusion myself of like, I think it's that they really don't know what they believe or why they believe it. And the reason why is because I grew up in the church. I went to youth group. I went to church from birth, and I went to Christian school through graduating high school. And I didn't know what I believed or why I believed it. I remember getting to Vanguard, studying theology and sitting in those classes and going, I don't know this stuff, right? I know the basic Bible stories, but I don't know this deeper knowledge when it comes to God or Scripture, the authority of Scripture, Jesus, or all the kind of big theological issues. And so that's where I kind of started diving into the world of apologetics and worldview. I started podcasting, when I was in my master's program at Christian Apologetics, and then I started blogging. I started on YouTube, and then it was about 2022 that I made it official. I actually in 2016, I launched an organization called Transition Ministries. And this was a missions organization that I ran that was helping youth transition well through life and kind of seeing the transition from high school to college and college to the working world as being one that had a lot of not stable foundations because of not having that foundation of Scripture and the knowledge of God to guide and to ground it all. And so then that kind of ministry ended in 2018, and then 2022 I started Think Well, where my goal is to train Christians to think well about the Christian faith and the culture that they're going to so they can engage the culture well. And I think that when we think about these things well, then we can be better ambassadors for Christ, better disciples and making disciples and followers of Jesus that really do provide change and create change in the world and societies and communities that we live in.
That's so good. And that helps me understand a little bit about why you're so passionate about Summit Ministries, because we're reaching students in a transition period of their lives.
Yeah.
You can say, based on the research of people like the social researcher George Barna, that what a person believes at age 13 is pretty much what they'll go to their grave believing, that your worldview is in place. But you've identified that there are windows of time when someone's going through a transition, when they are open to the truth in a way they might not otherwise be.
Yeah.
When you're transitioning from high school to college, or from college into your career, or from your career into being a married person, and even down things that happen to people. They lose their job, they lose their marriage. Those transition times are really significant times to come alongside people and help them grapple with the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's often these kind of times of transition where people start to question, right? When you are comfortable, when things are just kind of set and going the way that you want them to go, then there's not a lot of questions that come up because there's not a lot of unknowns. But once we are confronted with the unknowns, that's where questions start to boil up, where what we know comes into, confronted with the unknown. It's like, okay, what am I doing here? What's going on? How do I make sense of this? And so it is at that age that they start questioning their faith. Is there maybe in schools where the people around them are not believing what they believe, or they're going to go off to college, and what's going to happen here, and I need to be ready. And so it absolutely is a really crucial and important time. And so it's just a pleasure to step into that moment with students and help them walk through it well.
Ryan, one of the things you do, and I do this as well, is I watch the trends. When you work with a generation, you want to be sure you understand them as best you can. You understand them all individually when you're talking with them, but what's the overall cast of the generation? And we've seen for many, many years that religiosity, and I'm not even sure that's the best term, but it's a better term than spirituality to describe what I'm trying to describe. Religiosity has been on the decline. That there have been, every single time a survey is done, young people are more likely to identify as nones, those who say they have no religious preference. They're less likely to say that they're engaged with the church. They're less likely to say that God or the Bible is relevant to their lives. But we started to notice a change. There's kind of an upswing. And you work with a lot of young adults. I'm wondering what you're seeing. Is this a real trend, or is this just kind of an artifact of the way we're doing polling?
Yeah. Well, I think it's real. And here's what comes to my mind. And again, like, I don't have a lot of data to support this, but it's what I see. And I also know algorithms push the things that they know that you are going to watch. But when I go online, specifically when I sign on to TikTok, Jeff, like, every other video that pops up in my feed is some atheist arguing against the faith and live streaming. And I know that when I live stream on TikTok and I have a question of like, Jesus is God, agree or disagree, I had like 1,000 people join me in less than an hour on that sort of stream. And so what I've seen is that while, social media can be used very poorly, there is a lot bigger conversation. And there's so many people that are using these platforms to have conversations about faith, either against it or for it. And my feeds are filled with it. So again, I know the algorithm is sending me all that stuff, but I don't think that's stuff that we saw as prevalent in the past. And so there definitely is more people out there talking about this. And then when our Christian students are going on to social media, here's all the accounts that are coming up. And so I get messages from students who are saying, I watch this YouTube channel, or I follow this TikTok person who is arguing against the faith in these ways. Can you help me make sense of it? And so there definitely is, I think, a lot more of a prominent conversation, or the fact that everyone can get their voice out there has created this space where many more people are talking about these things. And now, because many more people are talking about it, it is causing students to question and to take these things seriously. I remember talking to my dad, who grew up in a small town in Texas, and this, and that everyone at his school and everyone at his church, they were the same people, and everyone in the town thought the same thing. And then there was no internet to show all these different worldviews and ideas and arguments against what they believe. And so that's just what you did, and you didn't question it. And so I think that students absolutely today, with the social media environment that they live in, is creating a bigger question, or at least a bigger conversation that is leading them to take it more seriously and asking the questions that they see. And I think then we see organizations like Summit and the rise of kind of apologetics and worldview critical thinking, a lot more books coming out that really is showing that Christianity has a solid ground and foundation and way to answer these questions and the deep longings that students have. And so I think that then is showing people that Christianity, rather than being baseless and made up and in need of being discarded, actually does provide a foundation that answers the big important questions in life, and people are turning to it.
There's some fascinating, weird things happening in the culture that I don't know that I could have anticipated. One of the pieces of received wisdom, and I'm putting air quotes around that, is that people's attention span gets shorter and shorter every year. And yet, Joe Rogan, who has one of the top podcasts in the entire world, features episodes of 3 hours in some kind of a conversation. And he has all sorts of people, conspiracy theorists, all different kinds of things on there. But he has brought on, well, for example, Wes Huff, who is a Canadian Christian apologist, for 3 hours to respond to all of the claims of these atheists that you are referring to. And the last time I checked, that episode had millions, maybe tens of millions of views. So there is something strange happening in a conversation where the top influential voices in the country are now bringing Christians into the conversation. And the other thing is, which is so strange, is, the received wisdom was always, well, girls, they think from their prefrontal cortex. Boys, they think from their amygdala, which is more action oriented. But you have guys who are, my own sons say, yeah. I mean, you keep telling us that our generation only has an 8-second attention span, but you've never listened to a full Joe Rogan episode, and we have, It's true. It's true. I think, okay, if you can't get it to me in 10 minutes, man, I got to move on. But they're just listening and diving in and soaking in deep conversations about things that really do matter.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever seen that before.
Yeah. And again, I think there's also, I mean, people are recognizing the fact that when you create good content, it does get absorbed and people watch it. And so here we have really, again, it goes against it, right? Mike Winger does the same thing. I remember when Mike Winger was doing his 2-hour-long videos and everyone's like, this is crazy. But look at how many views he gets on YouTube and how many followers he has when he does a 4-hour video on like one Bible verse, and just dives deep into it. And so there definitely are the people that want the quick answer and want to kind of move on. But when we create good content, when we are creating things that captivate, and that really do matter, studies are showing that people watch it and people are drawn to it and want to go deeper in the knowledge of these things and don't just want the simple pat answers. Because I think at least what I'm seeing with students is that they're getting tired of the simplistic answers that really just don't satisfy. And also don't give them a response to the questions that they're getting or the objections that they're getting to their friends. And I think that's something that we've done for a long time. It's like, well, just the Bible says so, or just, here's a simple answer. And then they use that in an online conversation. And I see this on TikTok all the time where the Christian jumps on the atheist show and goes, well, here's the answer. And the atheist just dismantles it. Because I think these simplistic answers are showing that this conversation is a lot deeper than we often want to make it. And I think this kind of attack, so to speak, against beliefs is forcing us into recognizing the need to go deeper ourselves as well.
Yeah. Ryan, what do you see as some of the big questions that young adults today are asking? I'm thinking of the parents and the grandparents who might be watching or listening now and maybe feel like they need to tune in a little more to what the conversation really is.
Yeah. It's always changing. And let me just say this a little bit is I just read this one book, Call to Question by Matt Anderson. And he talks about how almost we don't have the right questions. In fact, I do a lot of Q&As with students where I'm like, ask me anything. And sometimes the questions just don't come. And I wonder how much, and he talks about in that book, this idea of like the church has done really well at prioritizing or like maybe not asking questions, but then also we've done really well at school is we always award answers. We always want the good answer and here's a prize for a good answer, but how often do we give prizes for good questions? And so how much do we sometimes even just need to take students and explore the realm of questioning and teach them how to question to begin with so they know how to ask good questions? Because I think what the questions that I often face are questions that they're getting based on stuff that they learn in school, right? So a lot of questions on science and faith, on Genesis, on evolution, on dinosaurs, and that kind of stuff. Because if they're in a public school and they're being taught things that seem contradictory to what they're learning in Sunday school and their churches, then they're going to have questions about those things. I find that with gender and sexuality, like I've kind of specialized, my first year doctoral research was in gender and sexuality. And I go places and say, hey, here's what my research is on. I'd be happy to talk about these questions. And they just don't come. And it's almost as if, and I wonder if the church is almost, no, we have our mind made up about this. Here's the church answer. And then students are like, all right, I'm good with that answer. And I don't need to question further. And so I find that there's less questions on gender and sexuality these days, as it's just kind of like, we already know what both sides think and end of story. And don't see the need again to figure out where is that empty space of where we have yet to figure out things that we need to make sense of, and how do we ask these good questions in relation to it. So I think, the big questions of God, evil, and suffering, the hiddenness of God, those are big ones. Obviously, science and faith questions are big ones. And then I think just kind of, I've been finding an increase, and maybe this goes to the first question you asked as well, but I'm finding an increase of like, how do I talk to my friends about this? I did a Q&A at a summer camp this last summer, and it was the most different Q&A than I've ever done. It was like 2 hours, and every question was, I have a friend who's an atheist who says this. How do I respond to them? I have a stepfather who is really mean and abusive. And if I ever bring up faith, and he always just tells me my faith is stupid, what do I say to him? And so a lot of the questions are in the context of relationship, of how do I live this out well? And that's a shift I've seen as well.
I love that because those are relational type of questions. That's a second order question. If you're ever studying the Bloom's taxonomy, it's knowing the terms is one level of education. Knowing the answers is one level of education, but knowing how to apply the answers in difficult real world scenarios is a whole other level.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Ryan, as we and you and I talked briefly before the show about this. We've been watching trends about, I'd say it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, we began to notice a trend among young men that we work with, that they're re-engaging in unexpected ways. And now we're seeing a lot of polling about this. What I first noticed was, like, if I went to a Christian school in the past, I would be speaking mostly to the girls, and the guys were just there because they were required to be there. Now the guys are, when I ask for questions, they're submitting little 3x5 cards with their questions. I will regularly at a Christian school get 200 question submissions for what's only going to be a 45-minute Q&A.
Yeah.
They are really asking genuine questions. And what the polling now is saying is there seems to be a growth in religiosity, especially among young men, that's maybe even outpacing women. If that's true, that's a sociological phenomenon, the likes of which I'm not sure any civilization has ever seen. Because it's always been the case that women are more spiritual than men. Now we might be seeing something different. And it's a little weird because it's not just religiosity. It's not just more interest in the Lord. It is also, there's kind of a political conservatism that's part of it. There's kind of a focus on masculinity that is a part of it, pushing back against the anti-patriarchy narrative. That's all sort of part of it. And I'm not expecting you to have any real answers about this because I'm still trying to figure out the answers, but I just think it'd be a good conversation for us to have. What's the zeitgeist? What's in the water, so to speak, of our culture where we're kind of seeing some of these trends that are pretty unexpected?
Well, Jeff, I have all the answers. No, but really, if you don't know the answer, then I don't think I do either. But yeah, we can speculate. And here's one thing I'm curious about is just the shift that I think I've seen in the church and the rise of apologetics and the rise of worldview thinking and the importance of this and conferences all over the place, is that, when I grew up in the 90s in the church, it was a lot of the seeker movement. It was more surface level. It was a lot more, show and lights and fog machines and this sort of stuff to try to attract people. But ultimately what we were giving them was maybe something more shallow. And so then the question is, well, why is that attracting people? And who's being attracted by that? Who's really being retained in that sort of Christianity? And I think that when we saw kind of the failings of this and the need to grow intellectually in the faith, and as we've seen, again, conferences and all this sort of stuff popping up that really challenges people intellectually, then I think that is going to start to attract a different crowd. I think it's going to attract everybody in a different way, but maybe men are more attracted to that as well. And so there's definitely been a shift in the church, and I wonder just how much that has shaped also the religiosity among the genders as we understand genders to be different and men and women to be different and attracted to different things.
I think that's a great answer. It seems like what I'm seeing with guys is they want a whole life approach here. They aren't finding a lot of satisfaction in their jobs. They feel like maybe college is not for me. Maybe I'll go a different direction. I'm not sure what to do with my life. But when I go to church, we dig in, we go deep. I feel like I'm a thinking person, and I feel like I'm not just being catered to. I feel like I'm actually having to work at this. And men do really appreciate things that they have to work at in order to achieve. Okay, we got to keep tracking this. The first time I was thinking about it this last fall in relation to the election was when Ruth Graham from the New York Times wrote an article about the rising religiosity of young men. And Ruth's quite a well-known journalist, and she got a lot of traction from that. I'm wondering as you, there's one other trend here that I see when people become more spiritual or more religious, or there's a growing sense of religiosity, like in the Jesus movement in the early 1970s, there was also a simultaneous rise in cults. And they didn't attract as much attention, but they still were much more influential than they should have been because they were sort of riding the wave of growing interest in something. And I'm wondering, of course, we're here in Manitou Springs. It's just behind me down the hill here. All these little new age shops, new paganism. It's a big deal. And it isn't just here, buy some of our little potions and mix them up and do a spell because it'll be kind of cute and your friends will think you're funny. There's sort of a genuine belief that we should get away from anything related to the Bible or Jesus, get back to the fundamental elements of the earth, manifesting, all of these different kinds of things that are part of this.
Yeah.
You're in a place, in a state where you see a lot of this kind of thing as well. What's going on with all of that? And again, we're just speculating. We don't have to be experts.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what you're seeing.
Yeah, well, I think this kind of also goes back to the first question, right? So Justin Brierley hosted was a longtime host of a radio show, Unbelievable, out of the UK. Wrote the book a little bit ago called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And what he argues in this book, and I think is relevant as a whole, is just the failings of secularism. I think with the rise of new atheism in the early 2000s, right? So we kind of moved from the seeker movement of the church to the new atheism comes up, and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens are writing all these books about how God poisons everything and about how, God doesn't exist. And I think that we saw the failings of this as it kind of resulted in this deterministic, no free will, no ultimate purpose, no ultimate meaning, no ultimate, hope in life, and really this kind of depressing state. And so Justin Brierley is tracking the trends and showing that, man, there's this surprising rebirth of belief in God, and that we've really seen the failings of secularism to really account for the big questions in life, as well as the deep longings and desires that each of us have. And so I think that's one kind of reason for the shift towards spirituality. And then the second question that I wonder is when then the church has not maybe done a robust job at answering the questions about God of the Bible being evil, the killing of the Canaanites and slavery in the Bible and all this sort of stuff. And we've seen also moral failings within the church and how the church has dealt with moral failings of pastors and leaders. Then I wonder, it's like, okay, clearly secularism is false. There has to be some sort of God and spiritual substance, but I don't want that of Christianity. And I know a lot of people who have deconstructed and deconverted since the elections of 2018, seeing a strong tie of Christianity with republicanism and with the far right. And so it's like, okay, I want to push far away from anything Christian and the Bible and God related, as maybe the new atheists have convinced me that was all bad, as well as though I've seen the failings of secularism. And so I'm trying to find maybe this middle ground in this kind of spirituality without having to be strongly connected to either. And so I wonder if that's kind of the waters and the trends that we're seeing today in the studies.
Yeah, I'm always trying to figure out what is a reason and what is an excuse for people who walk away. Because I noticed, for example, I think it was maybe the Barna Group, not the researcher George Barna, but the company he founded, did a report back in 2019, and they were kind of digging into this a little bit, and they said 1 out of 3 young people who leave the church say that the church's mistreatment of LGBTQ people was one of the reasons they left. But when you look at, half of LGBTQ people say they are religious, 20% regularly attend church, which is lower than the American average, but it's higher than Gen Z as a whole. So it can't be the case. There's something else going on there. It can't just be, oh, well, they were mean to LGBTQ people, so I'm leaving. That's not a real reason. I'm not saying that there haven't been churches that treated certain people without dignity. I know that happens. But it is an excuse. It's not a reason. There's something else going on. And I wonder if what's maybe really going on is something that you've tapped into here, that the church isn't either the church is not saying anything about stuff that we need to understand from a biblical worldview that's happening in the culture, or they're treating it dismissively, that we shouldn't even be asking these questions because who really cares about all of that stuff out there in the world? And I wonder if that might be some of some of the objection. And that when churches, as you're saying, are going back and addressing and taking that stuff more seriously, that it's really engaging, especially the hearts of young men.
Yeah. I think that it can be the either or thinking that often is a problem where we just go, yep, absolutely. The church has been horrible. You're right. The institution of the church is bad. Run far away from it. Or to say, no, that doesn't happen. Come on. What are you talking about? But to be able to have a more nuanced view that says, yes, that absolutely has happened. And I've talked to LGBTQ individuals who have had negative experiences in the church. But I've also had students challenge me and say, oh, well, the church has mistreated people. And I say, can you give me an example? And they don't, because there's this narrative that they have adopted that this is what's taking place, even though they don't have any personal experience with it themselves or even know if it's true necessarily. And so that's where I think twofold is. Number one is when I've talked to students who are deconstructing or deconverting or having doubts, I volunteer with an organization, talkaboutdoubts.com, where I talk to people quite often where people are doubting Christianity. And my encouragement is, what about this person that you're seeing, or what about this reason that you're giving leads to Christianity being false? Right? I remember talking to one individual who was like, man, all these Christian musicians are walking away from their faith. And I'm like, okay, I get that. So what about that means Christianity? Like, are these musicians finding arguments against Christianity that you are concerned about, that maybe Christianity is not true? Or what about the fact that this person walks away means that you should walk away? Why are we following in that sense? So I wonder if there's a follower culture that these people that we respect are walking away and therefore I should too. And so part of that is trying to disconnect students from this narrative of saying, okay, but what about them leaving means that you should leave? Or what about them leaving means Christianity is false and therefore you should see it as false? And so trying to disconnect the stories we hear from the truth claims of Christianity and also the wonderful churches that are not having problems, that there are a lot of. I think the second thing that comes to mind is, as you mentioned, is how well is the church talking about this? So I remember in my first year of doctoral work, spending a significant time, as I mentioned before, on gender and sexuality. And I came back to my high school class and I taught a day on sexuality. I was going through the chapter of the Understanding the Culture book on sexuality. And so I brought in a lot of the content from my doctoral research into that. And I did a whole day trying to show the beauty of God's design for sexuality. And I remember getting done and saying, okay, to all my classes, and I was teaching 3 different sections of seniors at that time. And I said, has anyone heard, like, how many of you are born and raised in the church? Most of them. How many of you ever have heard the church talk about the beauty of God's design for sexuality? And not one of them had. Now, again, this is a small sampling. It's just 3 of my classes, but all of them is like, no, it's wrong. End of story. This is what it is. And we're always told the what, but we're never being given the why or the why it matters. And so I wonder if too, there's that aspect of how often is the church really showing this robust view of not only is this true, but it is both good and beautiful and really attracting and captivating our imaginations with this more robust view of the Christian truth claims and the beauty of God's design for sexuality and our lives and our bodies and everything else in our culture.
That's such an incredible answer. And I love that. I love that question. What about this deconstructing makes Christianity false? What do you think is false about Christianity based on this? Because that's what we really need to get back to, going beyond people's examples. Because people, everybody has a trajectory to their life. And sometimes you start to fall out of orbit. Everybody does. I was recently speaking with someone. There was a person who was a significant deconstruction. They were very public, and it was this huge collapse. Like the satellite just fell to the ground. And it was a huge story. This person is back in church now. They're re-engaging with their faith, but no one hears that. No one knows.
Right.
All they heard was, geez, they struck out big time, and I guess that's it for their lives. No, it's not. That's an episode. That's part of a larger story. So continuing to engage, I guess, is where I'm going with this, with your family members and friends. You don't have to make every conversation about this. It would be weird if every single conversation was about, so are you changing your mind about deconstruction? More of the conversation should be things like, what are you paying attention to these days? What book are you reading? What do you want? What kind of coffee do you want for break or whatever? It's just real life, but the continuing engagement, I guess, around intellectual things is something I appreciate so much about what you're doing. I got one more question here, and I didn't leave a lot of time for it, but what gives you hope when you're looking at Gen Z and you're seeing, as we've talked about, a hunger for truth and meaning and spiritual growth? But what are you seeing that God is doing in this generation that for all of those who are watching or listening can give them hope?
Man, students, I think, care about people. That's what I'm saying in Gen Z is a deep care for people. And I was just talking with a group of students on Sunday night. And one student, I said, hey, why are you involved in this study? And one student said, well, because I thought if Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses showed up at my door, then I wouldn't know what to say. And that killed me. That really bothered me, that I wouldn't know how to have that sort of conversation. Another student said, yeah, I'm doing this because I got friends in my drama class who's different than me. I got friends that live next to me who are different than me, and I want to be able to share with them. And so I think that what is really exciting is that Gen Z is very relational. They are engaged in each other's lives. They care about people in a sense, and then they want to use that well. And so those that are Christians are wanting to say, man, how can I be an example and point people to God through these sort of relationships? And that's why, as I mentioned before, a lot of Q&As are, hey, my friend is this, how do I talk to them? And my brother believes this, and how do I talk to him? And it's a very relational sort of way in which we're approaching this, because again, I think it's in the context of these relationships that students are being challenged and they're being exposed to objections that they have not heard before. And so they're trying to figure out, now, how do I respond relationally? It's not just about me understanding what is true, but I want to communicate that as well. And so that, to me, is what is very hopeful. And I think that there's also then a desire for truth. If I can share a story from Summit, this last summer, there was a transgender individual at Summit during my session, and I spoke on gender identity like the second morning, and this individual came up. She came up and said, I'm transgender. And I said, welcome. Glad you're here. Can I hear your story? Can we go have lunch? And we sat down. We probably had lunch 3 or 4 times over the 12 days. And on the final day, one of the things that she told me actually was, like, she said that your approach to gender was one of the most compassionate approaches. And she wrote in the review of Summit saying, the way he talked about it made me question whether I'm transgender. Right. And it reminds me a lot of what Christopher Yuan talks about. It's like, God's loving kindness brings us to repentance. It's how do we communicate this within the context of relationship? And on the final park day at Summit, she said, I want to chat with you. And she pulled me over and she said, look, I just want to let you know that I recognize that my transgender identity, my male identity that I have for myself, is a distorted view of myself. And she goes, I hope to find healing one day. And I said, what you're saying is you see that as a distortion of what is true about you, and that you hope that you can find healing to where you can re-identify as female and not be distressed and have anxiety and depression and things with that identity, that you can actually find comfort and peace with a female identity. She said, yeah, absolutely. I hope that. And it was because of her leaders in her small group, the Summit staff that you guys bring in, the girls in her small group discussion. Multiple girls from that group came up to me throughout those 2 weeks and started sharing just how the community and the relationships there at Summit were transforming this girl to be able to recognize that her transgender identity was a false, distorted view of herself, and to see herself and find healing through Christ and through the power of the Holy Spirit to see herself rightly and have peace with that. And so I think that is what gives me hope, is that when students are coming along each other in a relational way, pointing them to the beauty that is found in the Christian story, and that it is true and good for our lives, it is something that is attractive and attracting. And I love seeing the passion and desires that students have to be able to share that with those around them. And so that's what gives me hope.
That's beautiful. Ryan Pauly, thank you for coming on the show today. Think Well is the name of the organization. And of course, we're giving you the contact information for all of that in the outro here. But Ryan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Man, thank you. It's such a pleasure and such a joy to be able to have this conversation with you.
Thank you to my guest, Ryan Pauly, for coming on the show. You can learn more about Ryan's work at thinkwell.org. Does your teen or student have questions about the problems of evil or the other things we talked about in the show? Because if they do, I highly encourage you to check out Summit's 12-day Biblical Worldview Conference and Camp for young adults. It's 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, we equip students 16 to 22 years of age to defend, to own, and to live out a biblical worldview. They're building community with other like-minded young adults at the same time. They can make lifelong friends here, and they become leaders who make a difference in the culture. We address all these big issues, the problem of evil, the authority of the Bible, the person of Jesus. If you're interested in learning more about these events, just go to summit.org/conferences. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.